Good morning. My name is Ashley Johnson. I'm the Business Outreach Librarian at the Vernon Area Library, and today we're here with Beth Mueller. She's going to talk to us about 5 tips to dramatically improve your presentations. I'm very much excited about it. Hopefully there will be a little bit about the Zoom world and what presentations look like digitally now, because that's our whole life. So this program is being recorded. It will be available online. If you would like to share, please feel free to do that. All right, and I'll hand it over to you, Beth. If you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do, that'd be great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you to everyone for joining today. I am so excited that you're taking an hour out of your days to focus on something that I am very passionate about, and that's figuring out how we can be better at communicating and articulating what our ideas are and sharing those with whoever our audience is, whether that's one person or a whole crowd full of people. So excited you guys are here and get to spend an hour with you this morning. I am Beth Mueller. I have been helping companies and individuals tell their stories for the last 15 years. And a lot of that has been coaching around speaking and panel discussions, media interviews, all different kinds of ways that you would do public speaking and getting your message across, all to make sure that you're hitting the goals that you want for that, speech or presentation or whatever kind of the event itself would be. So really excited to take what I learned in those 15 years and bring that to you today. We're going to specifically talk through 5 different tips or concepts that I think if you can implement these into your presentations, you're just going to take them to a whole new level, whether that's in person or virtually. And we're going to talk through some of the specific nuances of a virtual presentation, because I know that most of us, that is our new world, and that is what we're going to be using for the next, foreseeable future at least. So I want to make sure I give you a lot of good tips around that too. So my goal is that you guys walk out of this presentation today with at least 3 really specific, actionable tips that you can implement in your next presentation. So this is all about action. So we're going to, you're going to hear from me quite a bit, but we're also going to do some exercises and help kind of solidify these concepts and bringing them home to you. And then at the end, we'll open it up for questions. And so as Ashley was mentioning, please feel free to put your questions into the chat or that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and then I can answer those at the end. So with that, let's get started. So the first tip that I really want to go through is really letting your passion and your experience and your expertise really drive your presentation. This is so important. There's a reason that you are presenting, whatever the occasion is. Somebody has thought that you are worthy of their time and they want to come and sit and listen to you present on whatever the topic is. And so I think that's really critical that we all keep that in mind and we help use that and use that energy to really enhance and guide our presentations. And there's actually research that backs this up. So Dr. Albert Mehrabian, who's a kind of pioneer in some of this research, found that there's actually 3 different buckets of kind of skills or cues that an audience uses when they're watching us present to kind of form this overall impression of us and kind of influences the takeaways that they have from the time that we spend with them. And so those 3 buckets are visual, vocal, and verbal. So from a visual perspective, this is really your body language. This is making eye contact. These are hand gestures, your facial expression, your posture, smiling, walking. I will say purposeful kind of movement or walking to emphasize points. These are all kind of different tactics or tools that we can use to help enhance how we come across visually to our audiences. And those are cues that our audience is either consciously or usually subconsciously paying attention to when we present in how they take in our message. So for example, eye contact, if you are making good eye contact, then the audience probably is going to perceive you as trustworthy, confident, you know your subject matter, versus if I'm just kind of like looking around or I'm looking down and I'm reading, it gives a different impression. The audience might kind of start to wonder if you know what you're talking about, or you know, if you'd rather be somewhere else, you know, all these different kinds of things. So one of the things I want to talk through, especially with virtual presentations, because this is a common question that I get, is how do you do eye contact when there's no one to make eye contact with? And the answer is that you really just want to be looking at the camera. So you want to have your computer or tablet or phone as much directly kind of centered on you as possible, so that you can look directly into the camera. You can put a Post-it note by the camera. You can put a picture of your family or somebody you know to help kind of remind you. But that's where you really want to be focusing your eye contact so that you have the best impression for your audience. Now, it's not natural to just look directly at your audience the entire time. So you do want to move your eyes around, but just, you know, overall, just maintaining good eye contact. Similar with hand gestures, I feel people fall into one or two camps. Either you love them and you use them, you know, really big and very often, or people just kind of hold their hands like this and they kind of do the death grip, I call it, and they don't want to move and don't want to move from this spot. Hand gestures are normal. They are how we communicate. So as the natural kind of progression in your talk, they're really helpful in terms of emphasizing points. Sometimes if you have like 3 takeaways, you could even count on your fingers to help emphasize that. There's a lot of different things that you can do with hand gestures to help kind of emphasize certain points, or even pause. Sometimes I have coached people to pause with your words, but use your hand gestures to really kind of help bring a point home. So same thing with posture. You know, if you're slouched over, that's giving a different impression than probably what you want to be giving. Smiling, you know, you want to be approachable. You want the audience to know that you want to be there and you have a lot of energy. And the same thing with walking. I'm a fan of walking when you switch points. So if you are in a room with people, you know, you could walk to one side of the room, state a point, walk to the other side of the room, state your other point, and come back to the center. Now, obviously, when you're doing virtual presentations, walking isn't quite as possible. And virtually, you actually only have, usually, from kind of your waist up to do all of your body language. And so in those cases, it's even more important to be doing good hand gestures and facial expressions and things like that, because you don't have the luxury of walking or other types of movement. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The next bucket is vocal. And this is how somebody hears us. So these are things like volume or intonation, your pace, if you use pauses or not, which I'm a big fan of pauses, and we'll talk through that in a little bit. And then just the cadence in which you're talking. So there's a lot of different factors that go into how an audience hears you. And you want to make sure that you are easy to hear and understand. I'm sure you guys can all relate. We've all been to hear people speak and you just can't hear them. That happens a lot online nowadays too. So if you want to, you know, somehow test and make sure that your audio is okay, that everyone can hear you, that's always a good thing to do. From an intonation perspective, this is it's how your sentences kind of either go up, neutral, or down at the end. So if so like a rising intonation would be, what do you guys think of that? So usually we use it for questions. A lot of times, not to stereotype, but a lot of times a lot of younger women tend to just naturally, you have a rising intonation at the end. So if you hear any like high school girls talking, usually you'll have a lot of rising intonation in there. And this is one of those things that you want to, again, vary, because you can use it for different uses. So like I said, you can do a rising intonation if you want to maybe ask your audience a question, or kind of establish common ground, which we'll talk through in a second. If your audience is probably not convinced on something either, it's another way that you can kind of connect with them and share and show with your voice that you're sharing what they're thinking. Falling intonation, when you end kind of more forcefully downward, that's really helpful if you are maybe making a point, maybe your big takeaway for your presentation or your talk, you want to end on a down intonation. With pace, you want to make sure that you're being careful around how fast you're talking, and then that bleeds into pauses, making sure that you're pausing effectively. So especially if you are educating something on a different topic, or you're maybe you're persuading a group to a new way of thinking, you want to make sure that you're giving enough pause that people can really absorb and take in that information. And then cadence is another way that you want to kind of think through this. And again, you can use this to your advantage, or you know, if there's a situation where you want to get someone really excited, so you want to talk really quickly and get your sentences really close together, and then balance that with the pauses later in the talk. So there's a lot of different tools that we have from a vocal perspective to really help reiterate what our message is and get that across. And then from a verbal perspective, these are the actual words that we're saying. So this is where we're going to establish common ground with our audience. We want to make sure that our audience understands we are there to serve them and to connect with them. So that's a really, really key point. We want to make sure that our audience, we're addressing what our audience's concerns are, and their questions and their objections and anything else that they might be thinking. And we want to be explicit with that. We want to even say it from the beginning, which we'll talk through openings in a minute. You also, this is where you establish your expertise. So why should someone listen to you? Now, in some cases, they'll know you, so this isn't quite as big of a deal. But in other cases, you really want to share your background and your experiences that led you to talk about the topic. And again, you know, really driving home your passion and your expertise in this. This is also where we talk through our main messages and our supporting messages. So the main kind of takeaway that you want your audience to have. And then all the supporting points underneath it. And then we'll talk through at the end a technique called bridging. And that's a really good way to use audience questions to your advantage and help kind of reiterate some of your main points that you want them to have. So as we think through these three things, I realize it's a little bit overwhelming. And I think some people make the mistake that we have to kind of get all of these buttoned up and be on top of all of these all at the same time. And that's not my intention at all. What I hope that you take away from this slide that you're seeing is actually that you have so many different tools available to you that you can work on and you can change and use to your advantage and play with, so that you can get the presentations that you want to be getting and leaving the impression that you want to be leaving. So I mentioned that Dr. Albert Mabrian is kind of the man behind this research. When he did his study, he actually found that visual and vocal accounted for a much, much greater percentage of the audience's impression than the verbal side. Now, I'm purposely not going to share the percentages with you because the actual study he did has been disputed just because it was a very controlled environment. And so it's not easy to replicate. So I don't want you to get caught up in the actual percentage breakdown, but I just want you to know that as a guide, how you come across visually and vocally is just as, or even potentially more important than the actual words that you're saying. And so I hope that also gives you a little bit of comfort, because a lot of times the people that I work with get very caught up and very worried in the words that are coming out of their mouth. And, you know, what if I forget what I'm going to say? Or, you know, what if my slides don't look right? And that's only a certain part of it. There's this bigger net impression that we want our audience to take away from us. And that's, again, consciously or unconsciously, these are the factors they're using to evaluate what it is that we say. And remember, an audience is only going to take away about 20% of your presentation. So you just want to make sure that you're using these to your advantage. And we'll talk through a little bit more in the other tips on how you can specifically do that. So that was really our first tip about letting your experience and passion really drive your presentation, really understanding that you have these different levers available to you to help reiterate your points and help get your message across. Now, our second tip is really about the structure of your messaging and how you do your talk. And that's about letting your goals really determine your story flow. So when I think about a presentation that I'm going to be working on, the first thing that I think about is, what is my goal for this? And usually goals fall into one of four kind of buckets: education, persuasion, motivation, or taking action. And I'm going to turn off my phone because apparently that is going off. Sorry about that. So education, persuasion, motivation, or taking action. Those are your four big buckets for your goals of your presentation. And once you know what your goal is, it's so much easier to put your story together. So if you get clear on what it is, so let's just take a hypothetical situation. Let's say I'm presenting to an internal team because I want budget approval on I don't know, a new software that I need. If I know going in that that's what my goal is, I can structure my talk specifically to meet that. And so what I mean by that is, once I know my goal, the second step is defining who my audience is and what they're coming into the room thinking and feeling, and what their wants are. Because we always want to be serving our audience. We always want to be connecting with the audience because that's why we're there, right? So once I know what their goals are and their challenges and their potential objections and things like that, then I can start to figure out, what do I need to say in order to get them from point A to point B. So it can be really powerful when you actually go through this. So in terms of kind of thinking through your audience, there's a couple of questions in the workbook that you can use that Ashley shared the link out this morning and put the link in the chat, just to help think through what are their questions that they're coming in with? What are the challenges that they've had in the past? What are the preconceived notions that they're having? What are they coming in with? And that's really information that's really powerful for you to have, so you can address each of those things in your talk. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, please answer, or please put your questions into the Q&A so that I can go through that a little bit more. But once you know that, and you know kind of the best way and what kind of structure you need to do for your talk, then you can start to really build out your story, right? So one of the things you want to do in the opening even, I have kind of a formula for 4 kind of key things you want to put into your opening of your presentation. And again, that's either in person or virtual. You want to really hook your audience in from the start. And you can do that through, in no more than 60 to 90 seconds, just keep it really short, especially if you're presenting virtually, because people are distracted. They're on their computer, or they're on their phone or tablet. And so it's real easy for them to multitask and do emails or other project work. And in order to bring them, in order to kind of give them that incentive to watch you from the start, you want to make sure that you are hooking them in from the beginning. So in 60 to 90 seconds, there are really 4 things that I would encourage you to think about, and that would be establishing this common ground, giving your key takeaway. So I want you to actually state what you want people to walk away from at the end of your presentation. I want you to, number 3, focus on your credibility and why, share some of your expertise or background that's going to help reinforce why you were there talking and why they should listen to you. And then number 4, I want you to explain how you're going to talk about the topic and how you're going to structure your presentation. So as an example, when I opened tonight, I went through kind of establishing common ground. So thanking you guys for coming, you know, understanding that you guys have a lot of things going on right now, but really excited that you're going to be working with me for the next hour on this that I'm really passionate about, which went into number 2. And I introduced myself and gave some of my background on, you know, my experience and why I'm an expert and why you guys should listen to me. And then I gave my takeaway. So I said, by the end of this class, I want you to have at least 3 actionable steps that you can implement to really take your next presentation to that next level. And then 4, I explained that I'm going to be doing that through 5 tips. And then we're going to end with a Q&A. So that's kind of how you would see that in kind of action. So I want to pause here and I want to really help you guys think through how you could apply this to your upcoming presentations. And I want you to think really broadly. So it could be, you know, maybe you have a meeting, a project update that you're going to present at a meeting. Maybe you're pitching a new client and you're trying to convince them to either buy your product or your service. It could be you're going to participate in a panel discussion. I just helped prepare an executive for that. They're going to do a panel discussion with 3 other executives in the Chicago area. You could be doing something as simple as, you know, presenting, not simple, but something not work related. You could be presenting to, you know, a PTO or a neighborhood association, a homeowners association. There's all different kinds of presentations that you might have coming up. And I just want you to take 1 second and just pick one of those. Just pick a situation, either real or hypothetical, and just think through what is that presentation? And then the follow-up to that would be, what is my goal for that presentation? What is it that I want my audience to walk away with at the end of that? So I'm going to give you just 1 minute right now, and I just want you to kind of think through that. If you're using the workbook, there is space for you to do this in the workbook, but you don't have to. So if you just want to write on a piece of paper, or if you don't want to write and you just want to think through it, that's great too. But just think through what's one presentation that you have coming up. Again, that could be to one person, a crowd of people, maybe you're getting interviewed on a podcast, anything like that, and think through, what is my audience, or what is my goal for that? So I'm just gonna give you 1 minute right now. I'll take water. And then once you have that, think about the audience that you're going to be presenting to. You know, one person or a crowd. What are they already going to know coming into that presentation? Just think through that and write that out. What are their objections or questions or challenges, or if you're going to be persuading someone, like if you're going to be trying to take a customer from a competitor, what are they thinking about that competitor's products versus your products? Just take a minute to think through that. And also think through what's in it for the audience. So if you put yourself in your audience's shoes, what are they going to get out of this? Why would they want to listen? Why would they want to do whatever your goal is? Whether that's, you know, take action on something or think a different thing or, you know, learn some tips to become a better presenter. What's in it for them in doing this and participating in this? So I'll just give you another minute or two to kind of think through that. If you have a good handle on that, you can move over to even thinking through those 4 pieces of how you would kind of create your opening. So thinking through how can you establish common ground. I'm even a big fan of just saying, you know, I've coached several executives to just walk into a room, especially if it's a room that might not be too friendly for whatever reason, and just say, listen, I know you are probably sitting there asking about this, this, and this, and I'm here to explain to you why my perspective on those issues, or, you know, whatever the case might be. But just really establishing that common ground that you understand who your audience is and what they need. And then another piece of your opening would be kind of your takeaway. If you already have that kind of established of what's that one thing you want them to take away. And it's probably going to be tied pretty closely to whatever your defined goal is. And then the third piece of your opening would be establishing your credibility. So what makes you, what experiences, what expertise, what education, you know, what's your current job, you know, any of those pieces, what is your credibility? What lends itself to why your audience should listen to you about this topic? And as you guys are thinking through this, one other point that I would add is that I think it's okay to brag a little bit. Sometimes I have found that people don't necessarily want to kind of flout all of their expertise, but your audience, it's valuable information for them. It's really important that they have the whole picture of your background and why you know what you know, so that they can listen to you and take that. So I would not focus on it as much as bragging, as more just, this is a piece of information that your audience needs, and you're going to give that to them right in the opening, because that's another lens that they're going to use to evaluate and think through their impression of the talk that you're going to give. So if anyone has those thoughts, hopefully that helps with that. And then the last piece, again, in your opening, is really explaining how you structure your talk. And this is something you might not have kind of ready at this point, and that's okay. But just think through, is there 3 takeaways, or is there a chronological order? Like, what makes sense in terms of kind of guiding your audience from point A to point B in a way that's as clear and simple and easy for them as absolutely possible. Because again, you're the expert, right? And so we just want to get them there as quickly and simply as we can. So I'll give you 1 more minute to think about that. And then the last piece of this is your call to action. So when we're thinking about how we structure our story that we're going to give, you always want to end on something that's a clear call to action. What do you want your audience to do at the end of this? It should not be ambiguous. It should not be implied. You should just tell everybody what you're hoping that they do at the end. And I think that's critical, and I think that's something that a lot of people miss, but that could have a huge impact on you getting the results that you want, is if you just ask at the end. So whether that is, I hope you take this into consideration as you consider budget for next year, or, I hope you take action. I hope you go to the website and download this ebook, or, whatever your kind of takeaway or your call to action is. I think it makes sense to just end on asking that. So I'll give you just 1 more minute to think through what 1 or 2 calls to action might be. I would challenge you to come up with 1 that you want them to do at the very end, but this could help kind of just brainstorming what your calls to action could be for this next talk that you have. Okay, perfect. So I hope this is an exercise that kind of walks you through how to tell your story. And I think a lot of times we just focus on, what's the slide deck that I need to create, or, what's a video that I can play. And you kind of get caught up in the, what are the pieces that I need versus the story that you want to tell. And if you start with that goal in mind, and then you work your way through, how do I connect to my audience? And then how do I create a good opening? How do I structure the presentation? And then what's a call to action that I can end on? I think you're always going to be in a better position and a stronger position and with a greater chance to actually realize what it is that you want to realize. So I hope that was helpful. I know I didn't give you a ton of time because we have a lot of things that we want to get through today, but just taking a minute to think through that and help that kind of guide your story flow and structure for all of your presentations coming up. Great. So that was our second tip. Our third tip is don't hide behind your slides. And that kind of goes into what we were just talking about. But it also goes back to, if I bring up our different keys that we have, if you just focus on your slides, you miss all of these other opportunities to connect with your audience, because you're putting a bunch of slides up that they're going to either be reading or distracted from, when I would really encourage you to have them focus on you a little bit more, so that you can really get across the eye contact, the gestures, the smiling, and these other kind of bigger pieces as well. So when I'm saying don't hide behind your slides, I know that you are likely going to have a couple, and that's fine. We'll talk through that in a second, some tips for making sure your slides are really good. But are there other visuals that you could also incorporate? And thinking through kind of bigger picture and telling your story. Are there videos that you could bring in? Are there any pictures of current customers that can kind of help tell that testimony for you? Are there even like a simple drawing that you could do on a board, a whiteboard? Can you do something really simple that is going to kind of clearly articulate what your message is in a way that's going to connect with your audience and just help them understand it? There's a great example that we have on the resources page for this class, which I'll talk through at the very end. I have a bunch of different example speeches that kind of reiterate some of these points. But this is one that I know most people are familiar with. But the speaker had a whiteboard just kind of off to the side, and he just drew 3 concentric circles and put one word in each of those circles. And that was the visual that he used for his whole presentation. And it was such a powerful way to bring the audience in, for whatever reason. We tend to like watching people draw or create things, write things out. And so, that's the popularity of whiteboard videos and a whole bunch of other things. So if you're able to do that, that's another powerful way that you can create a visual and bring your audience in without even doing a slide. So this tip is really about thinking through, number one, do you need slides? Number two, are there other visuals that you could bring in that kind of help tell your story and that you think are going to actually connect with your audience, right? Because we already know what our audience is thinking and feeling and the objections they have and a whole host of other information from what we just went through. So what visuals or other medium would help tell that story to them? And so that's what this tip is really about. And it's also just not being afraid to kind of be the center of attention and just let everyone look at you and let your passion and your energy and your expertise really come through. So that's really what this tip is about, not hiding behind your slides. So I'll stop sharing this again. Great. So the fourth tip, I realize that slides are often needed. So having worked at big companies for much of my career. So when you have to use slides, this fourth tip is really about sticking to a couple of powerful slides. Often we try to jam all of the information that we possibly can onto a slide. And in some cases, I think that's because we don't want the attention on us as the presenter, and we just want you to look at our slides and get all the information from here. But if someone could just read the slide, then why are we presenting, right? We want to make sure that we're bringing the story to life, and we're guiding them through the message and the takeaways that we want them to have as they're listening to us on whatever the topic is, versus kind of just throwing up a bunch of slides and saying, you know, here's the current status on this project, or you know, these are the 3 tactics that we want to walk you through in your project, or whatever it might be. So really being careful about using a couple of slides, really to reiterate your point, to emphasize your point, to reinforce. You can use it multiple times. So the one that I just showed you is a slide that we showed in the beginning, and then I just re-showed now, because I just want to make sure that that's one of the key takeaways I really want you to take away from today, is that you have all these different tools available to you. So I want to make sure I'm showing you that visual a couple of different times. So I would much rather do that and have a conversation with you virtually, of course, to help kind of talk through these concepts and these tips, versus just kind of showing you, you know, 40 PowerPoint slides with each of these. It's just a different experience. It's a lot easier for me to connect with you when I'm picking those couple of powerful visuals that I think are going to help emphasize the main points of my story and help you guys get to some actionable ways that you can really improve your next couple of presentations, and really actionable things you can leave with. So I hope that makes sense in terms of really using the visuals to your advantage. So our last tip, number 5, is about using audience questions to your advantage. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I think it's something that we all miss. I think, you know, some of the clients that I've worked with have just gotten so scared about answering questions because you don't know what they're going to ask, or they might be hostile, or they might be something you don't know or you don't want to answer. And I'm actually a huge proponent that questions can be your biggest advantage as a presenter, for 2 main reasons. So number 1, they give you a temperature check on your audience. So did I explain myself? What questions do they still have? You know, if it's a hostile question, I might not have done my job yet in terms of persuading them to my line of thinking. It's probably the best way that you can actually get inside your audience's head and see where they are in that moment, and how you need to kind of pivot or adjust so that you can kind of reiterate what your key messages are, and hopefully get them to where you want them to go. So again, step 1, or you know, point 1 of why I love questions is that temperature check of where people are. And then number 2, it's a whole nother opportunity and a whole nother way for you to bring it back to what your key messages are and what you want to tell that audience. And so I have a graphic. We're actually going to talk through one specific technique for this that I really like, and that's called bridging. So bridging is, traditionally it's been taught to people who are going to be doing media interviews, because you want to kind of control the message as much as you can in that environment. But I actually think it applies across any kind of presenting or public speaking that you could be doing. And so the technique is about, you know, your audience asks you a question. And so if we follow the graphic around to the right, you answer that question. And this is really, really important. You always want to make sure that you're answering the question that gets asked of you, because if you don't, if you skip this step, you look like you're avoiding it. And we don't want to do that, right? Because we're not hiding behind anything. We want to answer the question, but then we want to bridge. There's a couple of bridging phrases that I'll talk you through in a second. And we give a bridging statement, and then we move into our key message, or whatever the point is that we want to share. And then we bring it back to our audience. So an example of this, well, actually, before I do the example, let me talk through what a bridging statement might be, just so you can kind of have that in the back of your head. So this might be, I'd also like to add that, or let me share again. I'm glad you raised this point because this actually brings me back to, or here's the real problem. So those are just kind of examples. In the workbook itself, there's a couple of other ones that you can use. If you Google this, you'll find hundreds of bridging statements that you can use depending on what your specific situation is. But so we'll walk through an example. So let's say, we'll use this class as an example. And let's say someone asked me the question, do you really think that visual plays a key part in presenting? And I would answer you. So I would say, yes, I think visual plays a really key part. I'd also like to add that it's one of 3 different kind of buckets of tools that we have to really control or influence the overall impression that the audience has about us and our speech. So I hope that makes sense. So I answered the question. If you can say yes or no, that's always a bonus. I bridged, so I used one of those phrases. And then I went back to my key message, which is, you know, visual is really important, but there's 3 different areas that I want you to pay attention to. So you can use this in almost any situation. Like I said, it's mostly been taught for media interviews, but you know, any kind of presenting that you're doing, you can use this at family gatherings. You can use this one-on-one when working with a client or a colleague on a project. This is something that I just really encourage you guys to practice and kind of get used to doing. It can be really, really powerful when you get comfortable with it. So I'll give you kind of a hypothetical kind of personal example. Might be, let's say somebody came over to, well, let's say someone came over to my house right now in the middle of you know, quarantine and everything that were happening. And if they said, oh, your house isn't that clean right now, I would say, yeah, you're right. My house is probably not as clean as I want it to be. Having said that, I'm really focused on taking care of my girls and working full time, because I think those are the priority areas for me right now. So it's a way to answer the question and address the question and then bridge it back to something that's important and meaningful to you. So I hope that makes sense. We're going to pause in a minute to do Q&A, but before we do that, I want to give you guys just a minute to think through. I realize that this is a new technique for a lot of folks, and so it can be a little bit hard to grasp. So just want to have you guys think through, you know, write down if you want to, or just even in your head, you know, what's an example of a question that you might get for this presentation that you have coming up? And how could you bridge that back into a key message? So, and when I kind of practice this, or when I help other people practice this, we always start out by thinking through, you know, what are a dozen questions that the audience could ask me on this topic, knowing who my audience is. And then we actually think through bridges and key messages for each of those. But right now, just think through one. So what's one question you might get, and how could you bridge that back? So I'll give you 1 minute to think about that. Okay. So I think at this point, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we have time to answer any questions that you guys have. So let's open it up for questions right now, and then I do have a couple of other things that I could come back to at the end. But if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat or into the Q&A. So Ashley.
There are a couple here. Let me see. Okay, so I'm just going to read it. What advice do you have for handling mixed business audiences and their different desires for detail? For example, senior leaders prefer strategic level content and do not want to get into the weeds. And staff generally want to drill into operational details and specifics. So how do you manage not frustrating either? I'm assuming it's through stating the goals clearly and perhaps stating what will not be covered or what can be discussed offline. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. So I think you have a couple of different options when you have an audience that has different goals, desires, things that they're looking to get out of your presentation. So what I would challenge you to do first is think through, what is your goal for the presentation? Do you want to satisfy those executives, or are you more concerned with satisfying the more operational folks who need a little bit more detail? I would say you're probably better erring on the side of sharing less detail and then following up with more specifics. Whether that's a pre-read, maybe with some more information, or afterwards you can send like a complete deck that has all of the details in there. The challenge or the question that I would want you to think through is whether it's the operational folks who need a little bit more detail or the executives, what are the, say, 3 things that you want them to walk away with? And that's what you want to spend your time on in the presentation. And that's what I want you to really bring to life in the presentation. And then you can satisfy the informational needs for data, through, again, a pre-read, a post-read, maybe it's a subsequent meeting that you just dive into those details. But I'm always a fan of what are like the 3 things that you want everyone to take away. So I hope that helps.
That's good. So we have another question. We are often asked to send slide deck to non-attendees or without meeting minutes or action items. Detailed slides that stand alone conflict with the goal of making the presenter the center of attention and telling a story. Do you have any tips on how to manage this conflict?
Yes, and I am so glad that you asked this question, because this is something that comes up quite a bit. So I think you need to create one deck that could have as much detail as you need. So to satisfy, the operational level or whatever the folks are, you don't necessarily have to show all of those slides in your presentation though. So there are going to be cases when you have to do that, but can you take maybe 3 of those slides and show them? Can you up-level it a little bit for the actual presentation when you're actually telling that story and bringing that to life versus just passing along the information? So that would be the challenge that I would really encourage you to think through. What is the kind of presentation piece versus the information sharing piece? I would not create 2 separate decks. That's another question I get quite a bit that's related to this. I do not think you need, one deck for when you present and one deck to share as a pre-read or a follow-up afterward. Just do one deck, but can you just share certain elements of that as you're talking? And in some cases, I will say this is a goal, and it might not always be possible. Some topics, some conversations are a little bit more detailed, or you have to show visuals, you have to show graphics of data or examples of what people have said. So whenever possible, I would encourage you to kind of keep it to less slides and keeping the focus on you. That won't be possible in every situation though.
Very good. Then there's one last question, unless they start, oh, there's another one now. Okay, can you discuss any best practices around managing technology during a virtual presentation? For example, advancing slides, engaging participants verbally versus the chat feature.
Yeah, so great question, especially because my phone rang during the middle of this. So that was a great moment there. I think when we're talking about virtual presentations, there's so much that could go wrong. And I think the more that we just understand that and think through what those things are, and then how we would handle that if it does happen. So even thinking through, worst case scenario, if my internet went out today, I could still phone in and talk to you guys over the phone. Now, obviously that's not ideal and that's not what we would want to happen, but you do have some options as you're planning and practicing how you want to come across. In terms of engaging your audience, there's a couple of different ways that I think you can do that really effectively online. The benefit of doing written questions like what we're doing right now is that everyone is muted. When we talked about kind of your vocal kind of bucket of tools, one of the hardest things sometimes about virtual presentations is if someone's not muted or if there's background noise, it can make it really difficult to focus on you as the presenter and what it is that you're trying to share. So from that perspective, I am a fan of muting the lines and having either the questions come in via chat or Q&A, or you could open it up at the end and unmute the lines at the end and have people ask questions that way. Other opportunities for engagement, you can also, kind of like what we did here, if your goal is to educate someone on something, you can actually walk them through an exercise and give them a couple of minutes to kind of write their thoughts down on something. There's polling features in Zoom and WebEx and a whole bunch of other online platforms you might be using. Those are always fun and really, I think really are another good way to temperature check your audience on what it is that you're talking about. Are they understanding it? Are they feeling on a topic? Things like that. So really encourage you just to figure out what platform you normally use. Just play around with it and practice with it. So the platform that I normally use is Zoom. And I spent hours just playing around and just figuring out, oh, what does this do? And how do I look at this? And what's the gallery view? And things like that. So I think practicing and then when you're talking about virtual meetings, kind of preparing for worst case is always a good idea.
Yeah, preparing for worst case is the new normal. I know how often can we use the phrase the new normal, but the internet, who knew? So unstable. There's one last question, is kind of reiterating or going back to a previous point. To up-level the content, do you use the hide slide features so they get the entire deck, but you only show certain ones? Or are you kind of like remaking?
So I think it's up to you and your comfort level. I think the hiding slides feature is great and perfect to use. If it's easier for you from a technical perspective to just kind of pull those couple of slides out and that's what you're actually showing, I think that's fine too. I also am a fan of actually creating images of the slides, and then that's actually what I show, so that I don't have to mess with the PowerPoint at all. So I have one master deck, and then I pull out let's say 3 to 5 slides, and I create images of those, and that's actually what I show. It's a little bit crisper, I have found, in the room, especially if you're doing a larger scale projection. So that would be my thing. So yes, I would just create the one deck unless you feel more comfortable having kind of the separate presentation version, in which case I would do that. So great questions.
All right, well, that is I'm gonna turn my video on. That is it. We had a lot of great questions. It's 10 o'clock on the hour. I don't know if you had any final thoughts or I did share that link a few times. We will make the link to the workbook available on the YouTube recording of this, so you can get the full experience.
Great. And then I'll just add the very end of the workbook, there's also a link in there. It's to discoveryandstory.com/Vernon Library. And I have a bunch of other resources in there, sample presentations, different books that are recommended, all kinds of things that help kind of reinforce some of these points if you guys want to go a little bit deeper. So thank you guys for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Beth. That was a great presentation. Glad we could make it work.
Definitely.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, guys.